too often in our media in these last, not just months, but years, the perspective of better US-Russian relations has been treated as a subversive idea. And it's gotten, I don't need to tell you, there is anguish as we look at this footage from Ukraine. There's a barbarism. I haven't seen, maybe you have, I've never seen footage like that fill our screen. And I did write last week in the Post, the Washington Post, which is pretty tough ride to be in there because so many, it's 0.75% neocon. But the importance of not just showing Ukraine, but in these last years, we've been at war in Yemen. Think of the battle in Mosul, Afghanistan. We haven't seen Afghanistan except the coverage of the failed withdrawal, as it was put. So I think it's important to rethink. First of all, we should not have war. There should be peace, and peace should not be a subversive idea. But if there is war, it should be covered so that millions of Americans don't think it's a video game or a drone pinpoint attacking. I wanted to say what's needed, it seems to me now, and there's news today, just hours ago, that President Biden is open to Ukraine becoming neutral in a final peace deal. There's news that Putin has agreed to the UN help in evacuations from Mariupol's Azovstal plant. I'm sure in this sense we agree. What is so urgent is a ceasefire, urgently needed to stop the bloodshed, to stop and move towards some kind of negotiated resolution. Someone I've been working with at the Nation and at the Quincy Institute, Anatol Lieven, has written in these last days that 90% of an agreement is there to be had. But as you well know, it's much harder to start a war than end a war. And you've, I'm sure, followed what's on offer in a sense. It's shifted somewhat, but essentially what was on offer in 2014, the Minsk Accords, is not far from what could be negotiated today. A free and independent, sovereign Ukraine, neutrality, security not via NATO, but via a range of countries, no NATO, put off NATO, and the language rights for minorities in Donbass, where troops would leave the country, Russian troops leave Ukraine. And that's been on offer basically since 2014, and it was Germany, France, Ukraine, Russia. The problem then, as it is now, there are two central problems. The United States, and this is a US proxy Russia-NATO war. I mean, let's just not beat around it. It began as a Ukraine civil war in so many ways, really a civil war, which isn't to undermine Ukraine as a whole and independent sovereign country, but it's been divided in many ways over the years. And Steve and I have had so many friends in Russia whose great aunt, whose grandmother, whose uncle were Ukrainian. The interrelationships are so key. But in 2014, neither side was prepared, and that fell apart. What's also, and this is a very serious issue, there are neo-right, neo-extremist, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine who were in the Rada, the parliament. And certainly when Zelensky was elected years later as a peace candidate, he was elected as a peace candidate. The forces that were in such dominance in the Rada put in the constitution that they had to join NATO and wouldn't permit Zelensky to undertake what he was trying to. So he is a very courageous figure, but I say this with respect for him. It's not fully clear how much latitude he has in these negotiations. And I think what's key for us is that the United States, and this seems distant as we talk, play a role in pushing for some kind of negotiated resolution. But we're sending massive amounts of weapons. I mean, you know that, I mean, it's 3.5 billion, and that's just public. And the danger there is that as the war widens and expands, if it does, the danger of nuclear accidents increases. And the talk of degrading or weakening Russia I'll come back to that. But just as NATO expansion is not the single reason we're in this situation, but the degrading talk about Russia, about triumphalism and America is not going to lead to a policy solution. Chaz Freeman spoke the other day. I don't know if you've heard him. We were talking about him, but the painfulness of fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is what could happen if the weapons keep flowing in and there isn't an attempt to do an off-ramp, as some talk. The humanitarian crisis, 7 million or more refugees, displaced people, and this is going to metastasize through Europe. The training in weapons, we're doing some reporting on it, but these are sophisticated weapons that are coming in, and Americans are coming in with them to train. It seems to me that in our politics and our country and our media, there is emotion about what is happening, as any human being must feel, though we see violence so many places, as Jonathan King mentioned. But the opposition to war mustn't prevent efforts to understand history and context that led to this. It's as if you're not permitted to oppose the war because you're pro-Putin. That's not the case. You're pro-peace and you're pro-history and pro-context, which we don't get enough from our media. There is a kind of, and I think this was Matt Taibbi, who I hired as a researcher on a piece 20 years ago, a piece called The Harvard Boys Do Russia. And one disagreement my husband and I had is that I forgave Jeffrey Sachs because he seems to have repented. But he, he was in there, privatization, Yeltsin, the Harvard Boys. But there's a kind of rhetorical no-fly zone, as Matt put it, where if you raise questions, as we would in the search for peace or the search for an alternative to ongoing endless war, you are demonized. You are called names. And that I don't believe that people have to agree with Noam Chomsky or Steve, but at least you have to listen. And I think the ability to shut people down by calling them names has been a very destructive part of our politics and society. And not just in these last months. Russiagate, you could, listen, I'm sure Russia interfered in some way. The Washington Post had a list about a year ago of 144 places the United States has interfered in, but it just twisted and mangled the politics because you weren't supposed to talk about what are some of the real causal factors in our country that led to the outcome we saw in 2016. I want to speak briefly about what I think is the original sin, but I don't believe, as I said, in one factor. I think there are several factors, but NATO expansion. You know, at the end of the Soviet Union, and by the way, I want to post, Steve wrote a 10.2-page article, some of it's in the book, about how the Soviet Union ended. He very, in a scholarly way, reviewed all the different theories, you know, the empire, corruption, regions, and he came to a view which he never liked because he didn't believe in men making history, you know, but he did because but it, you know, the collision of Yeltsin and Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin had a will to power, Gorbachev had a will to reform. They clashed on the stage. And in that, Yeltsin, the head of Belarus and the head of Ukraine at the time, went into a forest. This, you've probably read this, in Belarus called the Bielozhevsk Forest, and signed a treaty ending the Soviet Union. So, but this end of the Soviet Union led to the discussions in Berlin, as you've followed, I'm sure, about the reunification of Germany and the promise to Gorbachev on the part of James Baker and George H.W. Bush and Kohl that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. A few years later, the epicenter of the Cold War, I mean, in 2008, there was the Bucharest summit, and suddenly Ukraine and Georgia were being offered NATO membership. There was a lot more in between, but at that time, people understood, Americans spoke out, there was more of a debate about how dangerous NATO expansion was. And there are documents, I know there are people who still contest that this was an actual promise, but Do you know the National Security Archives? It's a very good organization in Washington. They do a lot of work. It's a nonprofit. They do a lot of work on Central America, South America, but they have a team which has all the primary documents from the Gorbachev Foundation and team, which show the actual primary documents. In any case, even bigger than NATO expansion is what, at the end of the Soviet Union, at the end, the Berlin Wall, there was a triumphalism that America had won the Cold War. Those who were on the scene, like Ambassador Jack Matlock, no one won the Cold War. The Cold War was negotiated to an end. He would say, and Reagan and Gorbachev would say, nuclear war must never be waged, it can never be won. But there was a sense that the Russia that emerged at the end of the Soviet Union was weak, was on its knees, that it was a junior partner. And part of Putin coming to power, and his first act was to give Yeltsin and his family immunity from corruption, was to say, we're going to put this country back together. It collapsed twice, 1917, 1991. And in putting it back together, there was brutality then, Yeltsin's first Chechen war, Putin's second Chechen war. But I would say there were two important dates. 2007, when Putin went to the Munich Security Conference and said, this is no longer a unipolar world, Russia's back. And he spoke of Iraq, it was the height of the Iraq war. And he spoke of no longer being the junior partner. John McCain and Joe Lieberman and Angela Merkel sat in the front row, and their faces are still worth watching today, because you see they went back to Washington and there was great fear that Russia was back. And the second was 2008, which we've talked about, the Bucharest summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were kind of offered quick pass, but the Europeans didn't want it. So I believe that triumphalism. So I want to leave you with a thought that there were roads not taken, there were alternatives. There was an idea at the end of the Cold War that instead of NATO expansion, you might have a transatlantic European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Why, when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, did NATO continue? It is part of what, I mean, I've learned this term, you probably know it, I can never get it right, Ray McGovern. We've had our issues, but Mickey Matt, you know, it's no longer simply the military industrial, and even Eisenhower spoke of it as the military industrial congressional complex, but the media, the internet. But there was a demilitarized path, and there was a different security architecture that was laid out, and that for a brief moment in Berlin before James Baker and, you know, I think the United States they tried to reach out to Russia, but so momentarily and so briefly that there was never a real effort to include Russia in the security architecture of a new Europe. And in that bred grievances. And I'll say two more things. One is, I think we know, and this was moving along, but the idea of what is human security. All the military might in the world isn't going to help with climate crisis. It's going to make it worse, or food shortages, or nuclear proliferation, or global inequality, or pandemics. I mean, you think of the numbers in COVID, you were talking, Jonathan. So that is kind of now put aside, even though Walden Bello, even though he was campaigning, must have been interesting, because a lot of the world is not fully engaged in this Atlantic crisis. I mean, it's a human crisis, but a lot of Asia, Northern Africa, the Middle East, South America, not as engaged. The dismantling of the arms control infrastructure is terrifying. We're here now, and I think Steve is right that this is as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what's also not fully known, I'm sure you know it, is that the arms control framework has been fully shredded and dismantled. I mean, the big pulling out of the ABM in 2002, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was a foundation of arms control. And by the way, Mr. Bolton, John Bolton, played a role in both that in 2002, and then Trump brings him into the White House, and he abolishes the Open Skies Treaty. the only hopeful, and then the START treaty has till 2026, but that's not very potent. So you have this shredded arms control infrastructure, and one hopes that somewhere, even in the height of other Cold Wars, though this is a hot war, there were attempts to compartmentalize and begin to deal with some nuclear issues, because it's a terrifying moment. And China may come into this. So I want to end just, you don't negotiate out of fear, as Kennedy said, one of his better speeches, but you never fear to negotiate. And I think somewhere the fear of negotiating comes from the identification of diplomacy, restraint, dialogue with capitulation. It's not as understood how important the work you do, for example, is. June 12th, we're going to do some events around June 12th, 1982 is the 40th anniversary of a million people in Central Park. It played a role around the Global Disarmament UN conference. It also led a few years later to the abolition of an entire class of nuclear weapons in 1987, the INF. And I think we need to continue to commit, even while the UN and the Security Council are in such lockdown, but the General Assembly, the commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons, the continuing discussions around how to end, not discussions, but urgency to end this war, to find the ceasefire in the next few days, to negotiate, I think is imperative upon all of us. In different ways we can do that. So I thank you as a group for bearing the name peace in your name. And I will say the nation does not have peace in its name, but if there's one consistent thread in our history, founded in 1865, seriously consistent, because we've been ziggy-zaggy, and is the belief that military misadventure abroad does not permit true democracy at home. And I think it's not isolationism. It's an understanding about getting your house in order and working with other countries and not preaching in triumphalism. So thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. That was a terrific overview. We are so grateful. We have time for a few questions. First up, I'm going to call on Amar Ahmed, who is our organizer, and he's also the person that organized that study group you mentioned. Amar, do you want to pose a question?
Great, thank you, Cole, and thank you.
Sorry, before you launch in, Amar, let me just mention to others, if you want to put your question in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand with the reactions button, we will know that you have a question and we'll try to ask as many as we have time for. Go ahead, Amar.
Thanks, Cole. And thanks, Katrina, for your opening remarks. As you know, we did a book reading club with War with Russia ? With Steve Cohen. It was actually, for me, a very empowering experience. I learned so much, and I was exposed to a perspective that I had never been exposed to before. We also had a webinar with Ray McGovern, and I asked him a question about Steve Cohen, and he said that Steve was his friend, and he said that Steve Cohen was so ostracized in the last years of his life that when he was trying to donate money to a university to create the Cohen Scholarship or the Cohen Fellowship, they wouldn't even accept his money. So my question for you is, why was Steve so ostracized in the last 2 years of his life?
Steve was always a dissenter, but there was more company in the 70s when he spoke for détente, which is an old-fashioned word. I think Steve was early in taking on the worsening relationship, and above all, he never blamed it all on Russia. And not blame, but he thought it took two to tango. I'm sorry, that sounds terrible, but that the United States had a role in poisoning a relationship that was so vital for national security and for the world. What happened in about 2013 as the Ukraine issue, it was Ukraine issue erupted and arose, and Maidan Square, which was both anti-corruption protesters, but also right-wing snipers. But in any case, it was Ukraine. And Steve wrote about Ukraine in ways that led some whippersnappers. They were young, like Isaac Chotiner and Yulia Yoffe and Carol Young and one or two others. These were pundits with some interest in Russia, but they wanted on their belt that so it began with Putin apologist, Putin puppet, Putin toady. And it was like, how many names can you call Steve, who remained an independent figure? And it was ridiculous that he was anyone's puppet. But he was fortunate in that he had tenure. He had taught at Princeton for 30 years. He did worry about a younger generation, which figures in your last question. There's a group called ACES, which is the trade organization for scholars of the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine. So we wanted to set up a fellowship in the name of Steve's mentor. So it would be Robert Tucker and Stephen Cohen for students who were doing PhD work. We had it all agreed to, and then one summer weekend, we got a long letter of apology that the board had decided Steve's views were difficult for them to stomach, and there needed to be some reconsideration. It worked out. There was a New York Times article, but it was the head of the AAUP, free speech group, stepped in, and others who weren't as involved with Russia, but were horrified by this lockdown of opinion. And in the service, totally independent group that would have awarded the fellowships. It worked out, and it was painful. And Steve really, he despaired, but then he worked, and he believed in the larger work and his larger relationship with Russia, where we had the most eclectic group of friends. One of our great friends, by the way, just received the Nobel Peace Prize at the end of last year. We were talking about Walden Bello, but along with the Filipino journalist, Dmitry Muratov, who founded the newspaper Novaya Gazeta 35 years ago. It's the last paper to have closed in the last few weeks, very independent. And he's had some threats, but Steve was friends with all of these different people. So he understood that in arguing that US played a role in bad relations, Russia did too, that you weren't defaming your country, you were speaking a truth of some kind. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of people are asking for more detail on the prospective negotiations, or what would a negotiated settlement of this conflict look like?
And perspective on the negotiations and what would be?
And what would a negotiated settlement actually look like?
So the key piece of it, and it was interesting, Biden today spoke about neutrality. Zelensky, as you may know, has spoken about agreeing to a neutrality as long as Ukraine is independent, sovereign, secure. One could have pointed to Finland, but in light of the war and its outcomes, like Finland and Sweden are looking at NATO. But Zelensky's been very clear that neutrality is something he would agree to. And then it would be no entrance to NATO, that would be off the table, but that there would be a kind of security group, not the UN, not the OSCE, but another group that would monitor the security and independence of Ukraine. There would also be language rights. This is a very serious issue. When the leader prior to Zelensky came in, one of the first things they did was ban the use of Russia in schools and textbooks. But half of a quarter of Ukraine speaks Russian. We've seen this problem in the Baltics too. And Russian troops out. So that's the basis. But how you get there, as I said earlier, it's a very tough 10% road, and it does not help that there's not as much energy going into negotiations as there is into canvassing which countries have weapons to ship. It's understandable because but it's going to be a situation. Think of Afghanistan, where we poured in all these weapons. It's fighting to the last Ukrainian. And you can't deny agency, but it's just at this moment, it's also a war that is affecting every part of the globe, even while parts of the globe aren't as invested in the crisis.
Thank you. Brad Wolf asks, what would the alternative security structure and alternative to NATO have looked like?
So there is the OSCE. Sorry?
And the follow-up is, would it be necessary for the US to have been part of that?
So there is, Zelensky, when he came to Washington and gave that dramatic speech, he began to lay out his idea. It was kind of like security plus one. it would be 4 or 5 rotating, maybe not rotating countries. I don't think the United States, but that would guarantee security. Like, you can't do UN peace monitoring very effectively unless there is security on the ground already that they've agreed. There is this group called the OSCE. It may not be effective enough. The Organization Security and Cooperation in Europe, which came out of Helsinki, the talks in 1975, they are designed to monitor agreements. So I think if there's, not to be glib, but if there's a will, there's a way to find such an institution, which would not be NATO, would not be the UN, but be some design for the situation.
Right. Tom, how should we understand the Finns and the Swedes reacting to the Ukraine war with the fear of small states that are on the edge and considering their NATO option? And he comments that his relatives in both countries are in favor.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's serious. You know, Finland lived well by neutrality. I mean, you know, good economy, democracy. I think, and this is heretical, I will say that there was shock February 24th, the night of the invasion, Russia going directly into Ukraine. People who'd studied Russia for 40, 50 years, I think Steve would have been shocked, but Ambassador Matlock, Anatol Lieven, people just couldn't, they stepped away for a few days at least. I thought Russia would come into Donbass, but I don't think, and Crimea is different. I don't see Russia going into Finland or Sweden or the Baltics. I mean, it's kind of a persistent notion of aggression, but the Baltics have been there for, you know, you can't fault Finland and Sweden, but it's going to be more dangerous if they're, I mean, there's this I think NATO has made this part of the world more insecure and more prone to conflict. So I respect those in the country, but I still think it's not the way forward. I think to demilitarize as much as you can, even in the context of this crisis, which we need to work to end.
Thank you. Martin Halper asks, the US has shown no interest in negotiations with Russia or in having Ukraine reaching a negotiated agreement. And I have to interject my own comment that Secretary Austin's comment the other day was very much along that line, saying we're going to weaken Russia. How can we in the peace movement, Martin continues, how can we in the peace movement effectively raise the slogan, negotiate now, as we did during the Vietnam War?
Well, that war went on much longer. I mean, this is now into 2 months, but I think the costs of this war are becoming clearer to, I think, European countries. I may be, you know, I may be wrong, but I think the United States, it's now become, as I said, a US-Russia kind of proxy war. And in that, what General Austin said was in sync with what I worried about, the triumphalism, the weakening, the humiliation. And there is a little bit, not too little, but there's a kind of regime change frenzy in the air, which I think is what some in Washington have wanted for a long time. But I think there is an insanity. Biden, we should continue to push Biden, no-fly zone, no-fly zone. There are Democrats talking about men and women. That's not going to happen. But I think there should be a focus on negotiations and do as much as we can through alternative media, through writing your congresspeople. I will say I did a private briefing with 2 other people, Steve Miles and Phyllis Bennis, who's so good. Do you know Phyllis? You know Phyllis. This was about 2-3 months ago, and some of the Progressive Caucus had gone to Ukraine. And Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal, who I greatly admire, but they admitted they had not thought about this. You know, there'd been no thought, and this was before war. And to me, again, the Russiagate, for preface, has made it so difficult because Putin has become Trump and Trump has become Putin. And there's no question that there's an illiberalism in Russia. It's a very traditional, Orthodox Church, I don't know how you study Russia without the Orthodox Church studying it now. But I'm not being helpful. I think June 12th, these kinds of, and I think the arms control community, I think, has been skittish. But that's an area where I think there's more understanding of the peril now, generationally too, where there could be some work and attention being drawn. I mean, William Perry's no radical. You should get Jerry Brown, by the way, to come speak to you. He would. He's chair of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And he's very concerned about Russia, about nuclear issues, and China. We haven't even talked about China.
Okay, I'll take the bait. Talk about
Well, I
China a
mean,
little bit.
you know, the national security is the national strategic. It's not the nuclear posture review, but it's the national security doctrine of 2018 had in it that the United States' security doctrine was to downgrade counterinsurgency as a threat, but to make Russia and China our adversaries and to build up in order to confront that danger. I mean, we're talking like 2 or 3 years ago, right? It was before the pandemic. And you think, first of all, this is a national security document. This is anti-security. And now China is being very careful, cautious, and watching, you know, the United States hand, you know, it's stayed separate from this, even though it's been careful because of sovereignty and intervention and US intervention. But it's maybe the lockdowns or COVID lockdowns are affecting it more than we understand, but China's just watching this and may well benefit. It's sending its wheat around the world as the wheat basket of the world. Russia and Ukraine are in crisis, and it's making off, you know, carefully. But it too is concerned that Taiwan now becomes a frontal issue because of Ukraine. But I think there has to be real agitation against the nuclear security posture and this national security strategy. And there are people, you know, politically, this is not going to be a winning hand for, I hate to say it, for the Democrats. The Republicans are no better because they most of the time say Biden should be tougher, as opposed to let's end endless war. But I do think there's no, to begin in your communities. I know you're in Massachusetts, but still don't treat begin in your communities, write letters, try to speak to people. I end with what I began with, which is if people hear something different, they think, well, I didn't know that. And particularly in this case, so many people don't know how to think. And just to help them think, not help, but begin to lay out a different way of approaching this could seed some important change.
Absolutely, thank you. Let me ask you to lift up your eye from Ukraine, Russia for just one moment and take a look at the Biden presidency as it has evolved, at least on foreign policy. I think you told me you recently been to Cuba. What do you see in what's happening with the Iran deal? What's happening with the Yemen war? What's happening with, you already
Not
spoke
good
about
things,
China a little
Cole.
bit.
Not
Cuba
good. I mean,
embargo.
let me just say Cuba. I was there, and Steve and I were there in 2013 and 14. The sanctions have gotten worse, which is hard to believe. I mean, Trump's sanctions were lousy and cruel and, of course, counterproductive. A lot of people leaving, hunger lines, a lot of entrepreneurship, though, too. But these sanctions are worse to some extent. And it's, you know, it's really about Florida now. It's about Florida and Menendez. And Obama played a big role, bigger than I fully understood, because people in Cuba are still talking about that. And it would be very good, though I guess it's hard because Biden was his vice president, if Obama would take a lead on two of his issues, which would be Cuba and Iran. The Iran, that should be a no-brainer. But of course, it's not for reasons we know. And then also, you have in the Biden administration, and I think domestically, though it's often hard to disentwine domestic and foreign, you have some very good appointments. But foreign policy, though they're young, they're in the mindset of the indispensable nation. I mean, when Antony Blinken went and lectured Xi Jinping, I mean, you know, it's kind of like, okay, but there's a lot of talk, as you know, about the new blocs in the world, authoritarian and democratic. I think they're intermingled in different ways. I mean, in this country, we have our, and then there's a lot of talk about the rules-based order. Whose rules? You know, international law or the United States' rules. I'm trying to think if there's been, you know, I have to say, I just also think right now that I was struck with a story the other day in the Times, and I'll finish, but how Biden isn't getting credit for like the American Rescue Plan, which put a lot of money in different parts of this country, but some of it is how people relate to government these days. There's a concept called submerged government, which explains why the guy years ago, the Tea Party guy, remember, said, government, get your hands off my Medicare, because it's enmeshed in your life, Social Security, Medicare. And Biden isn't getting credit for some of the improvements. Now, Trump just took his pen and signed checks. I mean, but I think Biden's having a hard time. I think the White House is consumed, as it must be, with this war, and is not having a clear direction, and midterms are always tough for the power, those in power in the White House. I think there's some really smart people in Congress. I'd recommend the Progressive Caucus, though it's had its limits on this issue we're talking about, but Barbara Lee remains a force, and they have taken on Yemen and presidential power and authorization to use military force. And foreign policy is always a tough one. I think the Quincy Institute, with its limits, because realism has its limits, but has been a decent force in countering the kind of neoliberal, neocon think tanks in Washington. But I think there's room for more around the country.
And maybe this is the last question, but we have a massive Pentagon budget increase coming at us, and don't see much in Congress.
No, that's the
The
bipartisan,
military
it's like, it's the bipartisan agreement. I would have said before the war, because the war has made all of these defense companies, and by the way, they're not many of them anymore. They're like 4. Some monopoly work should be done. But I think that for a lot of people in this country, in Congress, it remains a jobs program in their district. And I think that has to, I remember Seymour Melman decades ago, but a kind of jobs that are more productive for the security of a country. But right now, I can't make it rosy. It's just these defense industries on steroids. And you see the Ukrainian ambassador literally was going to the defense companies to rustle up more equipment. And so there's such a premium on that. And the media, by the way, at press conferences, it's all about how much more weaponry is going to be sent. What's the military plan? And that feeds into the militarization. But I do think there's a way to begin to disentangle the defense budget if it doesn't become a jobs program, which it is in many parts of this country, and infrastructure. But of course it's crazy. I mean, it's 10 times, we have a defense budget 10 times larger than like 7 countries, including Russia and China combined. Now, it doesn't help when Russia and China roll out new hypersonic, but that's an agreement to be had, not to dissolve the accord.